Okay, welcome back. We are into section 17.9, which talks about the endocrine pancreas. And the pancreas is actually an organ, and it's this long, slender organ, and it's mostly located in the posterior to the bottom half of your stomach. And although primarily it's an exocrine gland, meaning that it produces and secretes digestive enzymes into ducts, the pancreas also has an endocrine function. It has things that are called pancreatic islets, which were clusters of cells that were actually used to be called the islets of Langerhans. Those are kind of an interesting name there. But like we said before, it secretes the hormones glucagon, insulin, and then new ones that we haven't talked about, somatostatin and pancreatic polypeptide. Um, let's talk about the cells and what they secrete. So there's the alpha cell, which produces the hormone glucagon. It makes up approximately 20% of each islet. And like we said before, glucagon plays that important role in blood glucose regulation where it will increase blood glucose levels. The beta cell produces insulin, and it makes up much more of each islet, 75%. And what it does is the opposite of glucagon, where elevated blood glucose levels stimulate it and it decreases blood glucose levels. Two others, the delta cell accounts for just 4% of the islet cells and secretes that peptide hormone somatostatin. Somatostatin is also released by the hypothalamus, and the stomach and intestines also secrete it. An inhibiting hormone, it basically inhibits the release of both glucagon and insulin. And the last is the PP cell, which accounts for about 1% of islet cells and secretes the pancreatic polypeptide hormone, or PP. It's thought to play a role in appetite, which is interesting, and as well as the regulation of the pancreatic exocrine and endocrine secretions. Pancreatic polypeptide released following a meal might further reduce food consumption, unless you're like me and you just keep eating even when you're completely full. And it's also released in response to fasting, which is also something that I've been trying out, intermediate fasting. So anyway, that's interesting. We won't get too much more into this. I mean, there's only so many ways that I really need you to understand what glucagon and insulin do. But once again, glucagon, there are receptors in the pancreas that can sense their decline in blood glucose levels. And you get those when you are doing periods of fasting or prolonged labor or exercise, basically any time in which you're not ingesting food and your body has started to use up its stores of glucose to produce ATP, your body is going to sense that the blood glucose levels are decreasing, and that will signal the alpha cells of the pancreas to secrete the hormone glucagon, which has several effects. It'll stimulate the liver to convert its stores of glycogen back into glucose. Remember, glycogen is just a really good way of storing glucose. It'll stimulate the liver to take up amino acids from the blood and convert them to glucose. And it stimulates lipolysis, which is the breakdown of the stored triglycerides into free fatty acids and a glycerol. Some of the free glycerol released into the bloodstream will travel to the liver, which converts it into glucose. So those are just three ways in which glucagon can tell your body that we need more glucose in our blood. Let's keep moving. The next is insulin, and we remember the primary function of insulin is to facilitate the uptake of glucose into body cells. So if you've got too much or higher levels of glucose in the blood cell, insulin will be secreted. Red blood cells, as well as cells of the brain, liver, kidneys, and the lining of the small intestine, do not have insulin receptors on their cell membranes and do not require insulin for glucose uptake. Remember, when we talked about that some cells only can use glucose as their energy. Other body cells, however, do require insulin if they are to take glucose from the bloodstream. Skeletal muscle cells and adipose cells are your primary targets of insulin. How does the insulin get triggered? Well, it's the presence of food in the intestines that will release gastrointestinal tract hormones such as glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide, previously called gastric inhibitory peptide. Seems like a little easier of a name, but that will actually trigger insulin production and secretion by, remember, the beta cells of the pancreas. Um, Precisely how insulin facilitates glucose uptake isn't actually all that clear, but we know that it appears to activate tyrosine kinase receptor, triggering the phosphorylation of many substrates within the cell. Anyway, I think if you just take away from this that insulin is triggered when blood glucose levels are high in order for cells to intake that glucose, and on the opposite end, glucagon is triggered when blood glucose levels are low to release stored glucose back into the blood. I think that's really all I'm going to ask you to remember. Here is a list of them again. Insulin coming from the beta cells, glucagon from the alpha cells, somatostatin from the delta cells, and pancreatic polypeptide coming from the PP cells. Okay, I think that's all I'm going to ask you to do. See you next one, 17.10 and 11.